pre-announcement, but anyway, this is being recorded, so it'll be in the recording. But I'll be in Antwerp next week, and we'll be presenting Inspector 8 for the first time as a preview. So I'm very excited about getting that moved along and in the hands of the people in the community. So that we're doing that next week.
Thanks, Vince. Well, if that's all, we can go ahead and start with the presentation.
All righty. I guess that's my cue, huh? Yeah. Let me do this and share my screen. Make sure I share the right one. You guys should be seeing a web browser, yeah? And then you should be seeing a slide.
Yes.
Excellent. All right, so I'll start out by saying, first of all, thanks for letting us come and talk about Gloss. This isn't just going to be a show and tell and a little demo of Gloss. Hopefully it'll be way more interactive than that. We're going to talk a little bit also about the journey, about how we started deciding to make Gloss not just a feature for a customer, but into a product. And we're going to talk about some of the messy parts of productizing a feature. We've been down this road once before as a company, releasing a commercial product. Hopefully we learn some lessons, but we're also hoping we get some good feedback that'll help us make the next journey even more successful. Certainly would love to field questions along the way. I'm not going to probably be focusing on the chat. And certainly there will be times when questions come up, I think, that I'll say, hey, Greg, can you answer that? Because it's way over my technical expertise. I don't develop on the daily anymore. So most of you are deep in the guts of FileMaker and will have a lot more technical expertise than I can bring to bear. But hopefully I can make some compelling explanations as to why we did this and what it's good for. And also how that factors into the business of what we're in collectively in the FileMaker space. And how Skeleton Key as a development company decided to try to take a stab at a product again. So be kind and let's keep going. So let's take a quick survey. Hopefully you all know how to use the raise your hand button. See if you can find that somewhere in the controls. And this is gonna be kind of a raise your hand, lower your hand kind of moment. I don't know if I'm sharing my screen that I'm gonna be able to see how many hands go up. So anybody else who's looking, go ahead and maybe Greg, if you can count how number of hands, and let's see what we get here in terms of people's experience. So raise your hand if you use container fields in your FileMaker solutions. Give a quick pause here. Yeah, I can bring up my participants window maybe. Looks like a lot of hands went up. Okay, lower your hands, please. Raise your hands if those container fields often contain PDFs. Okay, so a lot of hands go up. Go ahead and lower your hands again. I don't expect to see a lot of hands this time. Raise your hands if viewing PDFs in those container fields, in your opinion, is a great experience. Okay, I'm not seeing a single hand. It's not bad, I agree, and it really depends, you know, using Pro or Go or WebDirect, and how big is the PDF and what kind of Adobe kit you may or may not have installed on your computer. So it's variable, right? And I think that's a big piece of what makes it great or not so great. And then lastly, who wishes they could do more with PDFs without having to leave FileMaker and use some other piece of software or some other kind of workaround, just staying in FileMaker and being able to actually interact with those PDFs with greater facility. All right, seeing a bunch of hands go up. Awesome, that's the end of my survey. All right, now if I can figure out how to get rid of bar, I should be able to get rid of there we go. All right. So here's what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about what Gloss is. We're going to give you a quick why we created it, a little bit of how it works, we'll do a little live demo, and then we'll go even deeper into our journey to get here, a lot more about how it works. So kind of hopefully whet the appetite a little bit with the how does it work at the simple level, and then go a little bit more into the technical complexities and the library it's based on, and kind of answer a bunch of those questions. There'll be a little shilling at the end where I'll talk about how you could try it and buy it and so on. And then get your feedback on all of the above, not just about the product and maybe its utility, but where maybe it could go, or how does it work? And as necessary, I'll stop sharing and let Greg share and so on. And again, thanks in advance for anybody who's watching the chat and wants to interrupt with a question to my co-hosts there. I appreciate if you're keeping an eye on my flank there. So what's Gloss? It's a better way to view, search, and annotate PDFs without leaving FileMaker. It provides a better experience than you get in container fields, and better than any kind of workaround we've been able to create. I think we've all seen examples of different technologies or even solutions that have come out to allow you to do markup, or to allow you to maybe exchange a PDF with another app on a device and then bring it back in. And all of them just felt fragile and clunky. It creates a consistent experience across the different clients and across operating systems. So it doesn't matter whether you're using GoPro or WebDirect. About the only difference might be if you're using it's really not optimized for iPhone just because of the size of the screen, but on an iPad or a browser or FileMaker Go, it's a great experience and it's consistent. It does all the rendering on the server side, so it doesn't have to download and stream the whole thing. You'll see it here in a minute. You can very quickly navigate through a very large PDF and jump to pages, and it just sends you what it has to send you to be able to display the part that you're actually looking at. It includes search, so if there's a text layer in that document, you can actually search the PDF inside that web viewer. It has a full suite of annotation features. We all have seen annotation tools out there. There's a lot on the market, Preview and Acrobat and iAnnotate and so on, depending on your platform and preference. And there's a whole standard set of tools. And then every app has their own kind of maybe unique few. And our tool is no different. It has a few that are unique. But text and drawings and notes and all kinds of things are supported. And it's also compatible with the annotations that are created by those other tools. So if you are doing markup and annotation in iAnnotate or Preview or Acrobat, and then you bring that PDF into Gloss, those annotations will be seen and be editable, and then vice versa. And so it really is using the exact same annotation layer, just like the text layer. It just does it within FileMaker. You can customize the UI. We do allow you to select which tools you use in the toolbar, and so if time permits, I'll show you where that's controlled, but it's also documented in our help. And then it's really easy to integrate. And that's an important piece, I think, when we talk about the journey, how we took the technology that's available and we added a layer to simplify it and make it really easy for the average developer to add it to their existing solution without having to be quite as technically an expert as many of the people might be on this call, because we know it's a platform that's built also for citizen developers, and so we wanted to make something that was really easy and didn't require you to stand up the infrastructure that we stood up or master the complexity of all the API, and could possibly just do some copy and paste and get into your solution really quickly. Why did we create it in the first place? Well, we'll give you the whole story about the actual client that kind of prompted it, but container fields are great, but they don't do everything we want them to do. First and foremost, we already had experienced the inconsistency across Mac and Windows. We had, and also different operating version systems of Mac or Windows, and as well as whether or not there was anything from Adobe installed on our machines. We knew it was inconsistent and different when we went between GoPro and WebDirect, that even the same container field used in those different environments could look and behave differently. All the workarounds we'd ever seen and tried were complex and fragile and didn't always sustain and work and perform as well as we wanted them to. And they had various trade-offs as well, especially related to the fact that you were often leaving FileMaker and then coming back. So the ability to share the work that you were doing with others was limited. And that's a big piece of why people use FileMaker. It could be slow. It obviously didn't support annotation and didn't support bookmarking, didn't support searching, and a whole bunch of things. I could have filled a whole page with all the things that we couldn't do with PDFs, or that were suboptimal. So how does it work? In the simplest form, it's basically 4 steps. You have your PDF in a container field. We send that PDF from that container field up to Gloss. Gloss renders that and streams that back as web content into a web viewer, so you can view it, search it, annotate it. And then we send those annotations back to Gloss, where it incorporates those into the PDF and sends them back to the container field. And the way we've configured the Gloss demo and the scripts and example code that we provide, it does that in a way that's smart, in the sense that if you're on FileMaker server, it'll send the container data to and from the Gloss server directly from the server to the other server. If you're using it like with a local copy on your device, then it'll obviously send it right from FileMaker Pro or FileMaker Go. So it's got a bit of optimization there, especially of a large PDF. You don't have to worry about, you obviously have to upload that PDF to your container field in the first place, but from that point on, a lot of the heavy lifting of uploading a file and downloading it when you're done is done server to server. We're going to get into the details, a little bit more detail about how it works after we have a chance to play with it a little bit. So let's see the magic first and the sizzle, and then we can get into how the magic happened. So enough talk. I'm from Missouri. Greg's from Missouri. I've been here long enough, almost half my life, so I can say, let's show you how it works. I put this link in earlier in the chat. I'm going to show it to you again. If you go to skeletonkey.com, there's a gloss menu at the top in the menu bar. You can go to skeletonkey.com and search for gloss, or go to the gloss URL you see there. Fill out the form. You'll get a link. You can download. And when you download, you'll get the file I'm about to show you on my desktop, and you'll go through the same steps I'm about to go through to get your own API key to let you test out a copy of gloss right there on your desktop. So I'm going to drop out of this PowerPoint now, and I'm going to give you a little tour through it and show you some of the features. All right, so I've got my gloss demo file here. I just unzipped it. Zip file's about 30, 40 megs. It's got 4 PDFs in there just for starters. I'm going to go ahead and double click the file. It opens up with full privileges. We've got a couple little splash screens here you click through that kind of explain and give you a general overview of the interface, just in case you were to pass this sample file over to someone else. But the key thing here is I'm about to get asked to provide my email address so that I can get an API key that's unique to me. And this is a really important thing. This is a multi-tenant solution, right? So everybody has their own API key, every solution. So each of you will have your own. And that's what allows us to create a level of security so that the documents that I'm manipulating, even though I've got the same starting set of documents in my demo file that all of you do, they're really going to be unique instances of those documents as far as gloss is concerned. So there'll be my copies, Greg's copies, Vince's copies, Eric's copies, and so on. And that way, any of my annotations I make will be unique to my solution and vice versa. Now, if this was hosted as a hosted file, and I'll show you an example of that in a little bit as time permits, then obviously multiple people in the same solution would be using the same API key and therefore could start to collaborate around those annotations and those solutions. But for the sake of the demo, don't share your API key with other people, or you could end up with weird results because you're not really using a hosted solution for this part of the demo. So after you get through the get started screens, you'll get to this one that tells you what to expect next. And you're going to provide your email address. So I'll do that. The email is going to come from info@skeletonkey.com. So check your spam folder. I'm going to hit request. You only have to do this once. You're going to paste the code that you get from your email right back into the solution. So I'm going to go here in the background and open up my email client. I just got that email. I'm going to copy, and I'm going to paste. Once you've successfully pasted that token in, you're going to be taken to the main view that we've created in the demo file. And you will see, like I do, this slow code ebook example that we've uploaded. It's one of the 4 files that we've uploaded. And just to make things a little less confusing in case you're doing the exact same thing right now, because it can be a little discordant to kind of watch me do something different than the file you've got in front of you, I'm just going to go ahead and use this other PDF I have in the solution, which is a drawing from a blueprint from my house from years ago. And I'm going to give you a general tour of what this does. If anyone's having trouble here, go ahead and use the chat. Greg can help you troubleshoot, but you should all be at least into your demo file now with your API key, and you should be able to kind of have the same experience I have with a local file. You can go ahead and dive right in. You're all FileMaker developers, but I'll take you on a quick tour of the interface. This is the web viewer. I've got this PDF that's stored in this container field that's been loaded in there. This is only a 1-page PDF, and it doesn't kind of have a lot of, I don't even know if it has a text layer. So actually, I'm going to try a different one just to make it a little bit easier to kind of show you. All right, so this is a 4-page PDF. I can navigate between the pages. I can obviously scroll, and I can zoom as you'd expect or size it out. I can search for particular text. So here I'm searching for the word St. Louis or Lewis, and it's finding all the different instances and highlighting them inside the text layer. I can pan and move it around if I want to. And there's a little sidebar here where I can, look and see if there's any existing annotations. There is one annotation that's watermarked. I can also see if there's an outline in the PDF or the thumbnails of the PDF. So pretty standard options here. And this is the same experience I'd have independent of what version of FileMaker or what client I was using, ProGo or WebDirect. And I can show you that in WebDirect in a little bit. The real magic, though, isn't just our ability to search and our ability to navigate. That's nice, but it's to be able to annotate. So I'm going to click the little pencil icon here in the top right corner, and I'm going to get a card window now with a web viewer, which is now in annotation mode. And you'll see now I have a whole nother suite of tools, the same set of navigation tools I had before, but now I have the ability to actually interact with a series of annotation tools as well. So I've got a freeform highlight tool here. I can choose different colors. I can come in here and choose, a background color. I can choose an opacity if I want to, and a thickness of the line, and even a variety of different, kind of more sophisticated choices when it comes to how that will interact with other items on the screen. And then I can draw. In this case, I have that really ugly background color I didn't want, so I'm going to get rid of that. So I can even edit my annotations afterwards. Maybe I'm not happy with the color I chose. Maybe I'd like it to be thicker. Maybe I'd like it to be fully opaque. I can also, do a text highlighting. So let me go where there's some text and let me zoom in here a little bit. And let me go ahead and grab my text highlighter and say, I really like the green highlight. And so I'm going to highlight the text now too. And you can explore all these yourself here. I mean, there's an eraser tool that, will obviously erase in the case of, I think that primarily works on the freeform. So I can erase portions of freeform highlights. I've got a drawing tool, which has a series of similar kinds of tools for drawing, very similar to the freeform highlight. It's got a signature tool built in. I know that's nothing new for FileMaker developers, but it can be really useful to be able to take that signature and then put it, in different places or resize it and move it around as necessary and put it on the right place on the layout. Let me go ahead and zoom out here to get a little bit more view, maybe another part of the page here. Let me zoom in a little bit. We've got the ability to do stamps or images or links. So there's a bunch of pre-canned stamps that are in here. I can also create a custom stamp if I want to, and say, let's say a particular color and date, and create a stamp, put that on the layout, resize it and rotate it and so on, and do what I want to do with it. I guess I have to move it somewhere where I can actually rotate it. You can bring an image in. So, click here and it brings me to my desktop, and I can maybe go in here and get a picture of Milo and resize that. And so if I wanted to incorporate media from my computer, I can do that as well. I can even create links. A link then would be, to either a website outside the solution or potentially to another page inside the solution. So maybe I want this to jump to page 3. And then they could just jump me to that page inside the PDF so I can create links inside of it. I've got a note feature here where I can choose different shaped objects if I want to for a note, and a color for the note. And then I can, this is my note. And then I have various types of text and call out features. All these are pretty self-explanatory. This is something interesting. Can't believe I'm actually typing these the first time without typos in a live demo. And then drawing tools. So I can draw all different kinds of things that I want to draw. And again, each of these different tools that I'm drawing with, or drawing with, they have the same standard set of controls, very intuitive in terms of thickness, opacity, color, background color, and so on. When you're done making your annotations, you just hit save. And all those annotations will now be written into the actual PDF itself and then saved back into your container field, where now other users of the same solution would be able to see them. So if this was actually a hosted file, these same annotations would appear to other users in the solution, and then they could also annotate them. These annotations are stored in the annotation layer and have attributes associated with them. This is just a simple list of them that lets me navigate and jump to each of the annotations if I want to. But that's also being stored actually in the file as well. And in some future versions of Gloss, we may even be able to access those annotations as data as well. It's actually supported by the underlying library. We'll talk about that a little bit more later, but the kinds of questions I'm imagining some of you are asking yourselves right now. Other features of the demo worth mentioning, and then I'll pause here for a second before I go back to the presentation and kind of carry on with more information, because I want to answer questions just about usability of the system, because we're going to get a lot into the technical stuff. There's this upload feature here where you can choose to upload another document. I think I've got on my desktop, maybe not, maybe it's in here. I've got a larger file here. I'll insert that file. You can give it a description. This is some text. And now I've added a new document to my solution. It's now sending that to the Gloss server. And now you can see I've got a pretty large document. I can jump very quickly. I can do my searching for the values I want to search and do all the same things I just did a minute ago. One of the other features we added to the demo file, now this is really somewhat independent to a certain degree of what Gloss is doing in terms of viewing and annotating, is a bookmarking feature. So, you know, there are bookmarks. You notice we don't have a bookmark sidebar right here. I've got that currently suppressed. You might have a PDF that has bookmarks in the PDF, and we're really not talking about those kinds of bookmarks. What we're talking about is, imagine a workflow where I'm in this FileMaker solution, I'm looking at page 25, and I really want to be able to make a note about page 25. Maybe I want to assign an action item to someone else in the solution that will take them to page 25 and tell them that they need to do something. So we added a bookmarking feature, which uses a little bit of JavaScript we have running that's grabbing the current page number and lets me create a record and basically create a bookmark. So it knows this is page 25, and I'm going to go, so, you know, Greg, please see if this code is the right one. And there's my typos. So this is a FileMaker record in a bookmarks table. I can then, you know, let's say I go to page 35 and I make another bookmark, another one. And obviously, since these are FileMaker records, they can be incorporated into your workflow in any way you want. You know, maybe there's a way to group these or tag these. Maybe there's a way to assign them to somebody as a task that they need to complete. And by simply clicking on these bookmarks, this is able to then navigate me back to that correct page. So as I'm reading through a manuscript or I'm reading through some kind of contract and I identify particular aspects of it that I might want to also highlight, right now here I am on page 25, and I decide I want to take out my text highlighter and I want to highlight this section of text. And then maybe I want to add some kind of call out to say, you know, this is an issue to look into. You know, this combination of annotation and bookmarking could be used to create a type of intelligence and workflow around a particular page within a particular PDF where I have annotations and combine together to allow for interoperability for those users and those PDFs in a way that we currently can't do in FileMaker without really using some external apps of some kind and taking us out of this context. And you all know that, you know, if I've got a document record and I've got note records, now I'm starting to get into a relational environment, and I've now woven these into the actual media content that's in this actual table. I think that's the main parameters. There's obviously an export button here. This just exports the PDF from the container field. There's all the standard FileMaker functionality you'd expect here. The real magic here is in sending that container field up to Gloss and bringing it back into the web viewer and then returning that round trip when I'm done with my annotations. Let me pause here, field questions, then we can go back to the presentation and kind of get into the nitty-gritty technical details.
Okay, so the changes are saved with that PDF in the container field.
Correct.
Okay. What kind of thought was put into possibly preventing large bunch of documents, because I could see this being used quite a bit? And then is there a way to then say use S3 or something for the storage of those documents instead of in FileMaker?
So Gloss doesn't store the documents permanently in any way, shape, or form. They really,
Okay.
It's up to you where you're storing your documents. We bring them into
Okay.
the Gloss server and we keep a copy of them there. Correct me if I'm wrong, Greg. I want to say the current default is that we keep documents in the Gloss server environment to speed up the next time that you view them, because we check and see if they're still up there and they've been modified. If they haven't, then we can load them immediately for up to 15 days. You have the ability to control that as a developer too. You can tell Gloss to just abandon the cached copy and not keep them up even in the cache at Gloss if you want to. But where you choose to store your container data is up to you.
Okay, thank you.
Super
So-
impressive. Looks really, really good. Looking really good.
Thank you.
So I have a can I jump in with a technical question here? I put it in the chat. I'll just expand on it a little bit. So one of the features that I use on a web page is a small amount of JavaScript window get selection to string, basically highlight some text on a web page, and at least on a web page you can extract that text and bring it off into an email, for instance. So I'm watching the bookmark feature, and I heard you mention the page number. And I also noticed the annotation where you have the selection. So with that as a starting point, do you have the ability in the current version that you're working on to highlight a portion of text, and then when you're getting the bookmark, include the text such that you could bring it into the bookmark record in your FileMaker bookmark record table and possibly round trip it? Because if you could, that'd be super cool.
Greg?
So it's not built in right now. We do have the ability to do that, and we have done other customizations for one of our clients. We actually customized the buttons in the toolbar that are part of the web viewer that allow them to kind of grab some information from the current selection and the document. But it's not built into the Gloss product right now. Certainly something we could look into adding.
And yeah, that's cool. And that'd be B2 or whatever, if even possible. And then with web pages, I've seen, and I guess we've all seen URLs whereby there's after the main portion of the URL, there's a text portion, and when you load the page, it loads the page and highlights a portion of the text. Is that functionality available if you're interacting with a PDF as opposed to a web page? Just curious if that's part of the PDF API or whatnot.
Not right now. The closest we have to that right now is you can specify a page number to load when you're loading the PDF. And so Mark didn't show this exactly, but as you're scrolling through a document, Mark, if you wouldn't mind opening the data viewer, you can actually see a global variable being set as you scroll through the document. And you can take that page number and pass it. So if you see that first variable up there, the Gloss page number, that's changing as Mark scrolls through the document. And you can pass that same value back to the web viewer when you're loading the URL to load to that specific page. And that's kind of how the bookmark feature that we built works.
Okay. All right. Very cool. Thanks.
I think we use that too when we go to annotate, right? Like, so if we're at page 29 and we go to the annotate card, it doesn't move us to the beginning of the document. It keeps us on page 29. And similarly, when we leave the annotation mode, I believe it takes us and keeps us on the same page we were just annotating. So it creates a less of a jarring experience moving between those two different web viewers.
Yeah, Tony, I wondered if part of your question related back to that search where it highlighted what was searched.
Yeah, that's where I was going, and I don't know
Okay.
if it's a feature that could be built
Well,
because
it seems to me that you could do that already with your links, right? You already have your bookmarks. You can jump to a bookmark, and the bookmark can be effectively a highlight, no?
Yeah, there's really no relationship though between right now in the current version of Gloss, and when we get into the technical, like what Gloss was born from and what we put as a layer between the actual technology to make it multi-tenant. And so that's going to come up here. Maybe this is a good segue, but I want to make sure we get all the other questions out. Maybe we'll have enough technical ones that we'll just jump back to the presentation. But there's really no connection right now between a specific annotation on a page and that bookmark record that we're creating in the FileMaker file. All that FileMaker record is containing is what document, what page, and then any other text or fields that you might incorporate or links you might create to other parts of your database. There could be 20 annotations on that page, and it's just going to take you to that page. It doesn't have the ability to also then select an annotation or highlight an annotation or pull information to or from. Yet, as Greg described, when we created this for our initial client, because we were working with the entire stack that was available to us and all the API calls, we were able to create much more sophisticated interactions for them. But to bring this to a mass audience, we streamlined all that capability. We added a layer of security, and in doing so, kind of removed our access to the full rich library of API calls because we wanted to focus on 4 or 5 core initial offerings: view, search, annotate, the bookmark technique, and then a few other things like, you know, toolbar manipulation and flattening. The idea that you could take annotations and make them permanently part of the document. That's another feature we currently support. But there's a whole library of other capabilities which would allow the kind of more sophisticated examples you just described.
Yeah, and Mark, that sounds like we're all heading in the same direction here in terms of it's super pragmatic to get a product out the door with you know, a rich set of features that's useful, and then I'm understanding that there is a rich API that may or may not have additional functionality, including not so much referencing a highlight that is defined within the document, rather a highlight that's created on the fly, much as, you know, if you have a web page, and I'll drop one in the chat, where the URL contains a string that when you access the page, it highlights a portion of the text. But, you know, right. You got, you know, 1.0, 2.0, right?
Right. And I don't know, Greg, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that, you know, even if I have this text selected, and this is where my rudimentary day-to-day FileMaker skills are going to reveal themselves. But my assumption is, even though I'm in the web viewer, even though I have text selected, the simple action of clicking this bookmark button is going to lose focus on the selected text. I couldn't do anything here like do a pre-click script trigger to copy whatever text might be highlighted to the clipboard, which obviously pollutes the clipboard, and then carry that along as a payload before I create the bookmark record, which is stored in a variable with page number. Nothing that rudimentary would work, would it?
Not directly, but we do have the ability, when you do certain actions within the web viewer, when you actually select that text in the document, that can fire an event that sends the selected text to a variable in FileMaker. So it would be available to a script with a button that you would click, just like the page number is now.
Right.
It would seem to me that for 95%, maybe 98% of use cases, that jumping to the page is pretty darn good. Like, I don't need to know the 7th line. If something I'm just—
if it's already highlighted, right?
Yeah, I've already figured it out. If somebody's jumping to a spot in a PDF, they've been there before and they know where that is. So they've either annotated it or they've identified it, and you're jumping to it. You should be able to find it relatively quickly.
So let me give you guys some more to chew on, and we can always come back. I'm going to leave this up here. And similarly,
let me get to my obvious question that I asked in the chat. Is that in order for this to function, you have to have a connection to the API server. Is that correct?
Correct. Right now, Gloss is a hosted solution, so it does require internet access. You can run a file locally on your Mac or Windows machine. You can run a file locally on your iPad. You can host a file on a FileMaker server and access it from WebDirect Go and Pro clients. And all those scenarios, they can use Gloss, but either the client in one of those standalone solutions has to have access to the internet for the Gloss API calls to find the Gloss server and do the Gloss stuff. And or the FileMaker, actually in both cases, I think it doesn't matter. Either way, any client that you're using, WebDirect Go or Pro, has to have an internet connection to be able to work.
And then my other question is, so it's, I assume it's encrypted across that. It's using what port again?
All the communication is over port 6443, I believe, correct, Greg?
Yes, it is HTTPS, so it is encrypted.
Okay. And then when it's at rest over on the API server, is it encrypted there as well?
It is. We temporarily store the document, and we're using an encrypted bucket at S3 to do that. But all of the internal communication between all the different parts of the server are all encrypted as well.
Thanks.
This is
All
gonna
right.
be a big hit at Engage if you guys have a booth
We don't have a booth.
under session. Oh,
Yeah, we are a snack sponsor, snack break sponsor. We're
yeah.
gonna try to mention it during our sessions if we can get away with it. But with Valentina and I doing some presentations, we'll have to find a way to do that very stealthily.
Yeah.
Our hope is that folks like you will help us get the word out by trying it
Yeah.
out, and we have a lot of additional, I think, videos and sample files to create to illustrate, here's how you do the flattening technique. Here's how you do this other technique. All these things are covered in the help documentation, but we understand that, like the way I learned FileMaker is I just sometimes need it broken down one feature at a time with a sample file that shows me that specific thing. And then even some of the use cases, like how would you use this in research? How would you use this in construction? How might this be useful? It may just be a particular use of a particular annotation tool, but that might be what sets the light bulb off for somebody and helps them see how this could work for them. Even our own team, we found, who weren't involved in the original building of this project, when we had a recent conference with our whole all hands together, and we kind of started brainstorming how could this work. It took a few minutes for people to realize anytime a new feature comes out, like we didn't have this before, so that was closed off to us, right? People stored PDFs and they just used them, and they didn't really think about what else they could do. And the use cases for integrating bookmarks and annotations, even at a rudimentary level versus the deeper API calls into workflows, just wasn't possible. So, and most people have examples where they dump the PDF out, they do all kinds of annotations, and they bring it back and replace the original. The client we built this for has a pretty sophisticated workflow, not just some special API calls, but they have what they call like a master, and then they have individual copies. You can make overwrite the original, or you could have a version with your annotations for a particular research or issue that you're keeping track of. And they have, as we have support for permission-based control of what tools people are allowed to use. And so once they started enjoying the opportunity to think of all these tools as available to them, they started coming up with all kinds of interesting ways to change the way they work with documents, which is a central piece of the work that they do. It's very large volumes of documents which have to be researched, tagged, categorized, referenced, and then lead into all kinds of other workflow where summaries are written about with all this supporting material. And that was just not possible in FileMaker before. There was no way that it could have done it without just referencing generally to those documents without even being able to actually bring up quotes, citations, highlights, exhibits, and other examples really quickly. So let me let's get some technical stuff to satisfy
can I have another question now?
Yeah, sure.
So I tested the demo, and I'm on a slower connection, so every once in a while I get to see the let me see what that message is.
The URL transfer.
Yeah, the URL transfer. That message is coming from FileMaker or from like the web viewers application?
That is coming, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, Greg, this is coming from either the transfer of the container data. So if you're running a local copy of Gloss, like a Gloss demo file sitting on your desktop, there's no FileMaker server to do any work for you, right? So if I go back to my presentation for a second and go back to this drawing, when your container field in your web viewer on your local Mac or PC or iOS device, the container field has to transfer that up to Gloss. And at the end of the process, the container field has to pull that back down from Gloss. And so there's this process of moving the data in and out of the field that's local to FileMaker Pro from the Gloss environment. When the file is hosted and the FileMaker client, Pro client or WebDirect client is just the client, then the FileMaker server does that pushing and pulling. And so you don't get that transfer process. Is that correct, Greg?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, the reason I asked that question is because I had lost a connection to my server with another app that was open at the same time. And I got a message from it that, I'd lost my connection to the server. But at the same time, it was still the dialog box for the web URL transfer was still going on. And it made me think, yeah, there must be two different apps running at this, another app running in addition to FileMaker to be able to display those.
So a good example here, if I switch to my browser, I think I have that up here. Right, so I'm logged in right now to, this is another copy, right? So it doesn't have that file that I uploaded. And I'm running Gloss here in WebDirect. Am I logged out here? Let me log out. Close the file, let me log back in. So if I upload a document here through the WebDirect interface, I'll choose a big file here. Let me go to my Gloss demo. I think I've got some source files. Where's that big one? I'm looking for, well, I'll just grab the style guide. I had a nice big Apollo 17 file, but I don't know where it is. It's like 6,000 pages. You know, so I've got to upload the file, right? That's going to happen for the client just to upload. This is just uploading in WebDirect a very large document to a container field. This would be true if I was uploading it from FileMaker Pro or Go and putting something into a container field. You'd have that standard upload of the container data. But then when it sends that file up to the server, now FileMaker server just sent this 118-page file for me to Gloss. There's no insert from URL running on WebDirect for me. The server's doing that. That would be true if I was on Pro as well. That would all take place on the server side. And the scripts that we have inside the demo file are optimized to determine when that insert from URL step is running, whether it should run PSOS or whether it should run natively for the client. And then I can do, you know, all the things that we were talking about before. I have the exact same interface and experience here in WebDirect that I had in Pro. There's nearly no change whatsoever. It's the exact same functionality, same capabilities. So let's answer some of your technical questions. I'm going to give you a little bit of the journey, but I'm going to drive right into the technical details, because when we get to the solution, which is the second bullet here, you get to see some of the underlying technology. So how the heck we actually get to this conversation? Here was the problem. With this client, they needed to share large PDFs across their team, and they needed to combine those PDFs with project data. So those examples I was just describing, right? Gathering all kinds of intelligence and information, collating and grouping and tagging it, possibly having different groups of people working on documents on different types of research and information, and wanting to maybe even have their own copies of the document or sometimes share. They wanted to be able to navigate and search the content. So in their case, they had documents that often had a text layer, and other times they had documents that didn't, and they needed to have that created. They wanted to add bookmarks, but not traditional bookmarks. They wanted bookmarks that were in the FileMaker solution that could then be used with all kinds of other fields and values and workflows. Basically, they wanted to improve the intelligence and value of these documents and make them, tangible, and stop working in folders and all the other ways that they were working before using, traditional PDF products without a database or separate from a database. They wanted to access this from different types of devices, right? They had a core group of people in Pro, but they had collaborators that they needed to work with who they didn't have the ability to roll out FileMaker to, so they wanted to give them WebDirect access to it as well. And later, eventually, they gave them FM Better Forms interfaces to that as well. And they wanted all this kind of stuff to work everywhere, all the time, including on iPads, which they would sometimes take into the field, so they could access that research when they really needed it right there at the point of service. And they also wanted to have permissions control. They wanted to be able to say who could use which kinds of annotations and who was allowed to edit the original or overwrite and so on and so forth. So a lot of this obviously was stuff we knew we could do in FileMaker, but what was missing was the technology to allow. So Greg and the team did some research and identified a number of different possible options. Basically a server-based technology stack, which had a JavaScript delivery mechanism in the client side through a web viewer. You mix it with untold hours of skeleton key technical awesomeness, and they were able to produce this result of viewing, searching, and annotating in FileMaker. The reality is, behind the scenes, that the technology we leveraged was a tool called PSPDF Kit. PSPDF kit, got a link right there. I encourage you to go explore it. In fact, we might here even bring it up because it'll give you a sense of the depth of the API and the depth of the capabilities that you can see. The interface looks very similar because that's the tool we're using. It does the PDF to HTML rendering. It does the annotations. It does the flattening. It has the API that allows for the more sophisticated interactions, the actions that Greg mentioned, and so on. And we basically combine that with S3 for document storage, and FileMaker Pro and Server and WebDirect and so on to provide that solution for that single tenant. And that was about 3 years ago. And we've obviously had a lot of time then with the technology. But when we made that choice with that technology, you know, the licensing for that technology had much more capacity than this client needed. And so it kind of started the germ of this idea at that point that, you know, if we could do this for this one client, what could we do to possibly bring this technology to our other clients in a way that would be multi-tenant? And so that led us to the development of the Gloss API. That added missing pieces of the puzzle. That added account management, a layer of security, so additional encryption, the ability to support different groups of people using the solution without being able to access each other's documents, a logging mechanism, and then of course, to make it more palatable to a citizen developer community and a larger community, we wanted to simplify that API. And so we had to select, you know, and this is the hard-won battle. Every feature it has, the few that it has, is a testament to a battle that was fought internally on what needed to be in the first version and what we should include in the first version. Greg won a lot of those battles. And so we limited, I think for all the right reasons, the functionality to a core set, right? Viewing, annotating, toolbars, and flattening, with the understanding that, you know, there's a ton of other things that it can do. And since we've released Gloss, then, you know, of course, we have clients who've adopted it, who are asking for, well, can we just do this one other little thing? And then we can go to the API, identify how to bring that into the Gloss API and add additional simplified calls in FileMaker that are very friendly to perhaps novice developers to allow them to access with just another flag or another variable or slightly different call, another aspect of the deeper technology. And by doing this, it allowed us to create a multi-tenant environment with any number of FileMaker Pro or Server environments, all working through the same API, to the same underlying server technology, to the same encrypted bucket, without, you know, so while those documents are together, they're all controlled at that Gloss API level in terms of security, who can access what. Of course, there's a lot more to it for us on the journey. A lot of story mapping as to how we wanted to bring Gloss to users and what was MVP and needed right off the bat and what was going to be possibly someday made there, because we didn't want to build out a huge infrastructure for support and billing and features and capabilities before we could assess demand and interest. Similarly, we had hundreds of issues and a months of timeline as we worked on the project internally with a number of different developers. I think we got about 209 issues so far, and these span everything from acceptance testing, feature definitions, bugs, security, infrastructure, migration of our existing clients to an environment so that we could support, you know, a singular demo environment, a singular production environment, and manage some of our own investment and costs, as well as all the other ideas of all the additional features and you know, what if this, and how do we show people how to avoid that, and you know, things that we know developers could potentially do once they start experimenting with within FileMaker and wanting to be able to provide additional help and FAQs and things to guide them through best practices on how to do things. So this is an evolution and a snapshot in time. We also had to figure out pricing. So we had to, this is a Monte Carlo simulation I created that allows me to run various permutations of different types of licensing scenarios with different types of discounts, with different numbers of customers at different size licenses to try to figure out when do we even make any money on Gloss, and when do we lose money on Gloss, and when do we just break even on Gloss, and to help us predict how to price it in a way that was sustainable We never saw Gloss as being necessarily, a big cash cow in the sense that it was going to, let us all retire because it was such a profitable product, as much as we saw it as a tool that would enable our clients and their FileMaker solutions to become even more valuable and possibly create opportunities for us to do development or collaborate with other developers by bringing missing functionality to the platform. And so even if we had moderate expectations, we had to do a lot of this kind of work and learn things I never knew about Excel to be able to predict whether or not this was a worthwhile endeavor in the first place. And then, of course, marketing. There was lots of versions of the Gloss logo and things I didn't know how to do in Illustrator, and 20 takes to get a 3-minute video, and editing and websites and testing and improvements. And of course, all this is before we actually put it out there to anyone we weren't already working with as a customer. And so while our customers have been using Gloss for years, we haven't really had it out in the marketplace until just recently in October. So we know we're going to learn a lot more. So the rest of my slides are really all about Gloss itself as a product, the demo, the help, the licensing, and an opportunity to talk about feedback. But I imagine there may be some technical questions or other questions about its capabilities. So before I go to those parts of the slide, the last few slides on the deck, I thought maybe I'd pause here and see if there's other questions folks have if they want me to go back and look at any of the technical pieces of that.
I actually have a question, Mark. I know how hard pricing can be, so I can totally sympathize with that chart. And I'm thinking, wow, only one sheet. What factors did you consider? Like, for example, and this is you probably already know this, but there's multiple dimensions to pricing, right? There's looking at things like volume and API rates even, and all kinds of stuff. What kinds of things did you evaluate there?
So there were the simple costs that we evaluated. We knew we made some conservative estimates on operating costs for a server, labor costs for maintenance and support for a server for both demo and production. We had the licensing costs for the actual licensing from PSPDF kit, and our current understanding as to how that would scale if we were to add additional licenses to the agreement we have with them. There's also limitations, obviously, that licensing imposes on us in terms of exposure of the primary API key that we use in between the Gloss API and the server. So, which is why we issue you guys keys. That's part of our agreement with them. So there was all that basic stuff: labor, licensing, and instances of servers to actually run both the demo environment and the production environment. Then we got into, for us, really, I think, what would be a couple things. One is, what kind of multiple are we looking to get on those costs? And how does that dovetail when we look at various scenarios of the types of licensing models that people would agree to? And so we went through that probably, I think, 3 or 4 different permutations of, are we licensing this on, a per user basis? There's also constraints within the licensing agreement. They have a per unique user licensing agreement within a particular reporting period. So we had to think about, well, are we going to split the feature set by viewing and annotation versus just viewing and searching? Are we going to manage storage in a certain way and allow people the option to have a store documents if they prefer to have them stored in Gloss versus stored in their container solution? And do we want to have that responsibility? We started talking about different support programs and how we'd manage that. But I think the biggest factor for us was just trying to come up with conservative estimates of the number of different organizations that would license Gloss and how many users of what kind would be in those organizations in terms of needing to just view, search, and do bookmarking versus being able to actually be annotators. With the understanding that that was really something that the developer could control in terms of whether or not they allowed someone to go into annotation mode or not, and even which annotation tools they would allow them to have. And we could log and see that, but we wouldn't be able to, and we could charge someone back for it, but just figuring out the mechanisms. And we ended up, when it all was said and done, coming up with that slide you see there. I mean, our parameters here are 100, instances, various size licenses, meaning, from, just a couple of licenses to 5s to 10s to 15s to 20s, with much less frequency as you get to large sets, because it wasn't clear to us if there would be, anybody who would license 100 users or 50 viewers and 10 annotators. So it was mostly focused on what we thought would be lots of potentially smaller solutions, right? The average licensing price we've heard from Claris over the years is usually somewhere in the sub 3,000, maybe even sub 2,000 range. We're talking 5 to 10 users as a typical install for the volume. And then, of course, we all have clients who have much more licensing. So we knew that if we were releasing this for citizen developers or for anybody to use, and we wanted to make it easy to use, it was very possible we have, 10 or 20 5-user setups versus maybe 1 20-user setup. And so these simulations run that for every time I refresh the page, all different kinds of groupings, definitely weighted toward the small size. And then I split that into viewing only or viewing with annotation capabilities and various combinations of those things. And then, of course, based on that, a presumed load, like at what point would we need another server? Currently, the way the gloss technology works is, and the PSPDF kit requires a server. So we don't have the ability to necessarily abstract it in a way that can be just scaled automatically. So we had to make some predictions about load and what we thought would be sort of a threshold. And so we made some conservative estimates on that as well, to figure out at what point, when we reached a certain number of users, let's say 300 users or 200 users, would we need to just assume that the cost of serving would double and the cost of labor would double for maintaining, to just kind of hedge our bet. So all of my models were built on very conservative estimates on labor and underlying hardware expense, or virtualized hardware expense, in an effort to, and also a somewhat conservative approach to lots of smaller licenses as opposed to lots of big licenses, in an effort to figure out really where that sweet spot was, where we could price the viewing only features and the viewing and annotation features in such a way that we'd see, enough green here to indicate that we were, in many cases, likely to be at least profitable, as opposed to any red here, which would be that we were paying to produce gloss for the community. And I don't know that we're done, to jump ahead, this is the current pricing that we landed at. We landed at a viewing only and viewing and annotation. And we landed at a pay-as-you-go versus a prepay model. So the idea being with pay-as-you-go is that you as the developer decide which users you're going to extend viewing only or viewing and annotation features to by controlling the scripts and what you allow the web viewer to display, which you can do using any approach you'd prefer to take in FileMaker for security, extended privileges, privilege sets, flags and fields and settings and business rules. And then we are able to report on how many users access the view and annotation features or access the view features during a period and bill you accordingly. Or you could decide to commit to a certain number of those users in advance, and we bill you at a lower price and then charge you for any difference above that. And for us, it was really about, for us, the real driver to this is volume. We had to be really conservative about how many people would adopt gloss, because we haven't really been a product company before, with any major success. So we didn't know if this would be something where we'd get 20 people trying it out, or we'd get 2,000 people trying it out and actually liking it, because we know it's really powerful and useful. We know it's not trivial to set this up for yourself. And so we would hope that we could get this off the ground at this pricing model. And then if it grows, well, then we have much more leverage in negotiating licensing on the underlying technology stack. Our pricing gets more advantageous with them as the volume goes up. And we'd also get better data about load and how many servers we really need to serve the needs of our customer base. I think we also know that as different people use the solution, as we've already seen with some of our existing clients, they will ask the kinds of questions you guys have asked, which is, you know, can it do this? Can it do that? And there is a really comprehensive API. You know, if we go and explore this a little bit and look at the documentation, there's a whole lot of capabilities within the core PSPDF kit library that allow for actions and triggers and getting text from the document and managing those annotations as JSON objects and interacting with them as data, so that you could actually annotate a document and bring the annotations in and turn them into records and do all kinds of amazing things. And that is not exposed currently in the Gloss API. We explained how that other customer, you know, we did expose some of those things and were able to make those work for them because they had a much simpler setup. So as people adopt and potentially hire us to add those features to Gloss, the value of Gloss should go up. And at the same time, in some cases, that should help us drive the price down because we hopefully will get some increased volume. So we're new to this product game. And that's one of the reasons I think when Eric suggested we expand this topic a little bit, I was kind of nervous and excited at the same time, because there's several people on this call who have experience with bringing a product speculatively to market and trying to figure out how to price it and then how to turn that ecosystem and feedback loop into fuel to drive innovation in that tool, to help you keep the price stable or even make it less expensive, while at the same time improving the product. But we're just in the early days of Gloss with, you know, not too many people using it.
It certainly is very impressive, Mark. It's amazing.
I'll give most of the credit for that to Greg and the development team who found it, built it, and added the API layer. That's really them. I'm just the ringmaster.
Well, you can
Not the
create a
talent.
really good product and try to sell it, and somebody come along and compete with you and knock you out of the ballpark. So hopefully that doesn't happen, but
And I think the way Greg has described it is that, you know, you can go out there and license this technology.
oh yeah.
This is technology that, you know, I'm just going to jump to PSPDF kit. You know, this is technology that lots of companies use. And so you've used this in some of the technology in products like Dropbox and DocuSign and others. And, you know, and there are competitors to PSPDF kit like Apprise and a few others out there that that also are being used, you know, commercially in tools like Box and things. So this is a technology that's available. You can do what we did for that client and license it directly, which isn't a simple task in terms of just the negotiations, and pricing isn't published always. And I often want to meet with you to talk about that. I think if you go to the pricing page, it's, you know, contact sales, right? And then then you've got the infrastructure to set up. That was not a trivial process, and didn't optimize it, and to secure it, and to manage that with that customer, and minimums that they required for that. So these are all real big learning curves for us. I mean, to be completely candid, which is kind of our thing, you know, we licensed the technology at a higher capacity than the client needed. And so we've been carrying excess capacity in the licensing model for this product that we're not billing the client back for. Now, they paid for a lot of that development work and some of our learning, and we paid for some of that learning. But they're only paying for the seats that they use since we've stood up that environment. And we're, you know, we host for them and we do development for them. So in the long run, it's been a great partnership. But we knew, and we told them from the very beginning, like we were getting this technology and we were going to roll it out for them, and they were going to pay for our implementation for them. But we were going to try to bring this to a larger audience. And then we've continued, of course, over the years to learn more and more about it and to invest in upgrading and updating it, like some of the questions Greg was answering earlier about libraries and versions and browser support. So I think if anybody in the community, there's certainly lots of technical muscle on this call and beyond, wanted to build this out directly and bypass skeleton key and or the limitations that Gloss has, they certainly can do that. our hope is that, first and foremost, we can get this to a lot of people easily with just copy and paste with the help instructions, because you can in about 5 minutes migrate some custom functions, some scripts, and some layout objects and layouts over from the demo file into your solution, and will also work in your solution. And then when situations come up where we can enhance Gloss and roll those features out to everybody, that we might have opportunities to have that maybe co-funded, with developer and partners who want to bring those features and make Gloss that much better. But there's also opportunities for us to just do like we do with this other customer, which is, get a standalone copy and bring our experience in standing up this environment, and very quickly allow someone to have their own on-premise or their own cloud-based isolated instance of the PSPDF kit technology, where they wouldn't have any of the limitations that the Gloss API imposes. They would have, that environment to themselves, the entire API available to them, and that we could be stewards of that experience and participate in that and collaborate with them. We've got a really great track record, I think, of working with several other Clarus partners over the years in joint ventures, building that old product with 360works FMRPC. Got some great advice from Jesse and 360works as we were bringing Gloss to market on different things to think about in terms of pricing, support, and so on. And we've done other work with a couple other partners there, collaborating with them on projects for shared clients, or bringing in their expertise when we needed it on integrations with Salesforce and things. And I think the same is possible, that we'd like to bring this to the community and see how we can help grow it. Just to give you a peek at that other thing I was talking about, just for a second here. Let's see if I can hide all this stuff. This is the content management starter solution. And, I pasted in a handful of custom functions, and I pasted in, a handful of scripts, a couple folders right out of the demo solution. And I did them obviously in a particular order, right? I did some, quick renaming. I did a couple fields, and I did some renaming so I could copy and paste things in, so that the container field that's named something slightly differently in the content management would line up with my copy and paste operations. And, did a little bit of copy and paste of button objects, and was able to bring over that web viewer and get the same kind of functionality right here in the content management solution. There's the same capabilities. There's the annotation feature. Everyone remember this white paper about the total cost of ownership?
Yeah.
And, basically in just a few minutes, as someone who doesn't develop on the daily, following the instructions that Greg and the team put together, bring over Gloss into an existing solution that already had a container field, where I wanted to add this functionality to be able to do more with it. We're tinkering and talking about, again, I want to make a little video showing how to do that, because it really isn't very hard to do and the instructions are very good, but still want to be able to show people how easy it is to do. And then, there's also like, what if you don't have a container field already and you want to bring it over? So there's going to be all these other spin-off examples of it too. But we're hoping that people will get the Gloss demo file, take it for a test drive, and then realize that you can actually take the same API key we gave you, follow the instructions, and add this to an existing solution of yours, and it will work for up to 100 documents. It will work as long as those documents are under 200 megs. And the only thing it's going to do differently is besides the limits, is throw this watermark on there. And so you could actually take an existing solution in your development environment, add Gloss to it using the demo API key, and really take it for a full test drive in terms of what you can do. You can explore that bookmarking technique and the JavaScript piece and decide how you want to implement it. And then changing from demo to production, since we're not storing your documents, is really just changing a URL in one custom function and changing the token information in the scripts to the production token. And all that development work you might have done in Sandboxed would be preserved and just switched over to a production environment where the watermark goes away and the limit goes away on the file size or file count. So we tried to make what we thought would be a path to, try it, experiment with it, and then adopt it, that we would like if we were, developers in the community looking at this tool.
Now, Charles has his hand up.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not like me to actually put my hand up. I usually just like speak out. So I just wanted to go back to something that you touched on, and And in your defense, I don't think you even drilled it in enough, and I respect that. Anybody could go out and build this. Okay, my team, we could easily whip this thing up. But I talked to Richard Malloy. I had a look in my email here from PDS Kit. I talked to him a number of years ago, so he had this exact use case. And the cost of the licensing, the development and stuff like that, it's so prohibitive. You may think that you have the time and you can afford to go and build this, but the reality is it is so much cheaper to go out and buy a product like this and take advantage of it than to try to develop it in-house. And unless you have tons of time in the world and you had a really cheap client or something like that, it's simply just not worth it. And for the price, I think the price is absolutely excellent. So I'm really, really wishing you a lot of success in that, because I know myself, we literally use that same library we're going to, and then we stopped because the licensing is really expensive, or at least it was at the time, and imagine it still is. But it's really, really powerful. So the fact that we can kind of share and tap into that cost a little bit, where we're effectively diluting it, is just awesome, I think.
Yeah, and that was not a prepared statement, so I can't thank you enough, Charles.
No, that's
great to get that perspective.
I've been down this road already. So
right, yeah, and it's really kudos, I think, to Greg and the developers at the time who identified this tool and negotiated that with Richard and the team at I don't know if it was Richard back then when we started, or if that's just who we've been working with the last few years. But, I don't think we had a context for that, right? We didn't know. We knew it could be done, and we knew this technology could do it. But I don't think we had a benchmark against which to compare that pricing. And it was probably, I think, to a certain degree in our favor that they hadn't maybe been approached by someone looking to specifically add this functionality of the FileMaker platform. That might have been maybe we're the first ones who approached them about that. I don't know. So we certainly have some narrow constraints around, that this is for us to use to incorporate into FileMaker solutions, and for this particular client and for others, as long as we create that layer to abstract and protect the licensing key. But it was a gamble, and we were really lucky that we had a client who could see what was possible, and was willing to help fund the initial, introduction of that into their solution, so we could learn how to take advantage of it, and that Greg was able to see and then make manifest the vision to make it as simple as it is now. When you start looking at these scripts, they're not crazy complicated, but they're not trivial, and optimizing them and getting them to work and making them easy to understand. I mean, I was able to go in here. My best testament to this is that I was able to test this thing and find bugs. I was able to make some decisions about naming conventions and implement them after the solution was done. And as someone who doesn't do daily development, find places where things need to be fixed and troubleshoot and tinker. And if I could figure that out, having spent so few hours in the last several years under the hood, I think that for even a relatively new developer in the FileMaker space, this is going to be a pretty easy copy and paste option to introduce it at a price point that I'm glad to hear, Charles, at least you think is reasonable. Because I do think it gives a lot of punch for the price and without a lot of work to implement.
Hey, Mark, I have a question for you and Greg.
Yeah.
Have you considered turning this into an add-on?
Yes.
Okay, just curious.
Yeah, I've got to, at some point I got to tap, like Jeremy created that add-on for simple color swap. And I think we've made an assumption here that we started with the assumption that you've got container fields already and they're not really performing the way you'd like. So how do you add this to a solution? In that context, you need to bring the code in and bring it around your container field and have it find that container field and start to interact with it just through some quick naming matching at the time that you copy and paste. I would like to make an add-on so that we could say, if you don't even have a container field or you're thinking of adding, let's say, a related container table, just use this add-on and let that be your storage and let those containers be powerful right off the bat. So that seems like a natural next step. But I think that gets back to the roadmap thing, right, Vince? And that, that's one of the many issues that we could work on. Did we have to have it to go live? We said no. And part of that may be just a lack of a full sense I have as to how popular are add-ons. Like, I don't know, is that going to make a difference, you
Yes.
think, in its adoption?
Well, I mean, I think it would make a difference in terms of integration. I think I started exploring add-ons again recently, although, Claris is halfway through it because there isn't any way to really update them. And so I'm not sure what the plan is there. But one thought I have for your product would be, so instead of worrying about where the containers are, what if you were to have one central place where you force the containers through there? So like imagine if you would, like a user would say, oh, I want to edit this PDF that's in this container. And you add a button that you could just drag your add-on to the layout, and it basically adds a button, and that button is basically a link to set that container into a card window that is part of your installed add-on. And now you have a central place to do your editing. So now you don't have to worry about how you're going to integrate with all the containers everywhere, because now you're bringing the focus on, I'm going to edit this container, and now I bring a sheet down. You have your add-on component where it focuses on edits to this container, and then it somehow takes that change and then saves it and then moves it back into the container that they're actually working in or where it's saved. So maybe that's the next thing that you could explore, right?
And I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think, in some ways those are two separate things that you brought together, and I don't think they're incompatible. But even just that approach, this idea that we've built Gloss in such a way that the demo file exhibits a certain workflow, right? It has a workflow related to, there's this table of documents, and the container is fed into this web viewer, and then there's this related table of bookmarks. And we leave the files, up in the cache at Gloss for 15 days, and it's kind of like the default setup. But there's no reason why any developer worth their salt couldn't decide to modify that interface and that user experience with Gloss to say, look, I don't want to put this on every container field everywhere. I just want to centralize this, and I want to have like a global container field that's feeding Gloss, and I want that to be in a card window that's sort of universally available. And I'm going to basically hook that into wherever it makes sense within my solution to bring a container data into the Gloss environment and then bring it back to where it comes, and only have to set this up once in a solution. And so an add-on would certainly make that an easy way to do that. But the scripts and the functionality are all really there as sort of building blocks for a developer. And that's the kind of sample files, I think, and additional issues.
There goes my AirPod.
You guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, great.
Good.
That's the kind of example files I think I'd also like to create, is to kind of show people that, you don't have to do Gloss just this way, the way it is in the demo file, or the way it is when you drag it over to content management as a sample of how to implement it. You could implement it in a more sophisticated or centralized way. You could take control over the user permissions and user experience in terms of the toolbars. You can discard the cached document if you prefer, from a security standpoint, to only have it there for the annotation session or the viewing session, but immediately have it go away, so the web viewers would not be displayed until they're invoked by the user to be brought in. All of these things are capable and possible just by using the right calls and the scripts and the APIs that we do provide. So we do provide the sort of upload the document, and we also have a call to say delete the document from Gloss so that it comes out of the hosted environment. And I think that example of having a singular Gloss setup for a multi-container field solution would be a great sample file to show people, so they could, again, just kind of see the possibilities and not get boxed in by the demo. I think that was another real learning curve thing for us. I think when we built the demo file, is that it runs the risk in the demo file of saying, here's how you use Gloss, as opposed to saying, here's a demo file where we used Gloss. And it's not the only way that you can use it in a solution.
Very cool.
Indeed.
Thank you.
How much work has it been?
Greg, this is where you should have been recording all your time.
Yeah, I can't really. Yeah, I couldn't answer that. There was a lot of work that we did in the early days that was all about the user experience. Not the technical back-end work, but how do we really make this tightly integrated into the solution that the client already had. And they had a very tight vision for the way they wanted it to work. And so we spent hundreds of hours doing just that part of it. But there was a lot of work that went into the back end and getting things. There's several server components. There's a lot of things that I had to learn about. It's using containers, and there are multiple containers that are running. There are multiple web servers. There's a lot of technologies that are in the stack that make it all work. There's a SQL database. There's just a lot of stuff. And it was, hundreds and hundreds of hours, but I couldn't tell you exactly how much. And then that was, getting it to work for that particular client. And then the idea that we wanted to open this up to make it available to others and make it multi-tenant, again, it was hundreds of hours of work to go through that part of it and lots of testing to make sure it's going to work well.
Thank you. How does it is it because of the annotation part? Is that something more something that would a user would use with an iPad or a tablet device with a pencil or something? Have you seen that, or have you played around with that, or is that kind of a more approachable thing?
I didn't plug in my iPad for the demo, but it looks and behaves the same. I mean, it's slightly different. I think a little bit more. I found it a little bit harder without a pencil or a nice stylus to be able to interact with the web viewer just because of my finger. But the experience was pretty much the same. I've got my iPad Pro. I just don't know how well charged it is. It looks like it is. I think I can find a cable. I can plug it in here in the background. And I haven't been watching our time, so I want to be cognizant of the amount of time we should be spending, and make sure everyone gets their questions and we don't run long, keep people from families. But it's an equivalent experience as long as you're using an iPad. I think we haven't really done much with the phone, although you certainly could. It's just what I think I can show you. I can show you this here. Let me show it to you really quickly. I'll show it to you right here in Pro. And then, if we resize the, what happened here? I think it will. If we resize the card window, see if I can get this to be small enough where it can really show it to us. I know I've done this on the iPad a little bit more easily. I should probably do this with a smaller PDF. Hold on a second. This is the 800 and something page, and I'm using a local copy of Gloss. Let me switch over to my browser, my Gloss demo. So when you get into a responsive situation, obviously the web viewer dApps, and the annotation tools will collapse. And so it has some nice responsive capabilities built in. Let me go to the freeform highlight. And then, you get a whole nesting of the capabilities here. So you get some of that kind of experience when you start to get this onto smaller devices like an iPad. I have an iPad Pro here that's got a really nice amount of screen real estate. So it works really well. It feels like I'm working on my laptop. I get this on an iPhone, or I get this on a smaller iPad. And I start to find that I get this nesting happening with the different tools, and that doesn't feel to me quite as good. But I'm simulating this by just making the web viewer smaller, right? So I think we haven't been positioning this as something that's a good fit for iPhone because while all the tools work and they are responsive and will naturally adapt as necessary, it's a lot more taps to get what you want out of that experience. I'm going to try to launch this over here on Go just so you guys can see it as well. Cancel. I'm not going to watch that movie. I'm going to launch FileMaker.
And it obviously works in WebDirect because that's what that demo page is right now.
Correct.
So seems to work really well.
Now I'm running into authentication here. Hold on 1 second. Get a code. 722245. Go to Gloss. All right, let me launch QuickTime Player and I can show you guys this device. New movie recording. There I am again. And now I can show you my iPad. All right, so here's Gloss on my iPad. I'm using my finger, not my uncharged pencil. I'm logging into that same hosted file, so I'm seeing that style guide that I uploaded previously. You know, and I'm getting the same exact experience, but I've got to, you know, tap, and if you don't have a stylus, you know, you've got to be able to hit those targets. But generally, my experience has been with the interface is that it's really built in a way that's pretty friendly. It's only when these windows get smaller on an iPhone that you start to find yourself dealing with that nesting issue I was able to simulate earlier. You know, and then there's the artifice here of I click here on a text highlighter, and then I have to figure out what's the right way to select the text and interact with it. So for me, I don't spend enough time on my device to feel like that's really comfortable, but you can do it. Just takes a little bit of practice. And I think that's user issues here, not functionality.
Very cool. Any remaining questions for Mark? I gather you're going to be at Claris Engage.
Yes, we're a snack break sponsor. I'm doing some presentations. I don't know if I'm talking out of school telling people that, but I'll be doing some presentations, but not on Gloss. So we'll be there. We'll obviously have Gloss with us. Greg will be there as well, and several other members of the team. And you know, if I can weave it into my presentations, I will. See if I can get away with that.
Cool. Well, some people have had to leave already, so I think maybe it's a good point to thank you and Greg for coming out, taking the time, Mark, to present to us and share this journey that you went through to do this. Amazing investment in time and energy, and I think I also equally share the sentiment that Charles was saying. Wishing you the best of luck with it, and really, really cool.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us. We appreciate the opportunity to show it to you guys and for all the questions. And welcome any feedback afterwards. Please take it for a test drive, and you know, keep an eye on our Twitter and our blog. We'll let you guys know as we release new features or new versions or new videos and so on.
Cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Have a great night, everybody.
You too. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
You know, Keith said he was leaving, but he's still there. Well, so Tony's still here. Anything?
Do
Anybody
you
want
want
to
to
say?
stop the recording, because that seemed like a clean stop on
Yeah.
the presentation portion?
Yeah, that's fine. Unless somebody
Um,
has something else they'd like to put on a recording.
No, just thanks again. Really appreciate you guys
Thank you.
hosting us on short notice, Eric, and giving us this platform to share this with you guys, and pushing us to kind of maybe pull back the curtain a little bit. I wasn't planning on that, but it was a lot of fun to kind of share this with the community and folks who built products and know that journey and have succeeded at doing it. I'm hopeful that we can be successful as they have been.
Yeah. Well, I think it's great. You made the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you.
So,
Since we're all friends here, a question for Eric on the logistical side. I'm on the committee for this group. What's the story on December? I saw, without giving, the gentleman from New Zealand potentially presenting. What do you guys do in December?
just whoever we can get.
Okay.
Even Mark Richman could nominate somebody. Go find him and put him on here.
We've got in the queue, since we're all friends here, in the queue, we've got Albert, what is Albert doing? Oh, I saw him. He's potentially going to do something with the LA group, otherwise known as FM Disc, I think. But he's in the queue for something at some point. And then the gentleman from New Zealand, that'll be terrific. All right.
I've been considering Ernest Coe or somebody like that. We're trying to find somebody who can do something related to higher education. So if anybody here knows somebody who can
Well, the
give
gentleman from the guy from New Zealand, and I don't know, what, Eric, you want to kind of early release, whatever. They basically are the juggernaut in the New Zealand educational market. I'm not talking about against anyone, but that's what they do. So you got a good coverage there.
Yeah, that'd be good. Although he does say he's like it's K through 12, which it has similarities to higher education, but higher education can be a whole nother monster.
I bet.
Hey, well, I'm going to peel off to get home to my family before it gets even later here. Thanks again.
Okay.
Thanks for the show.
Appreciate it, guys. Thank you very
Mark.
much.
Looking great.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Charles.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Probably drop there's a group for like research and something or other, and I guess higher ed is and yeah, I don't know, does Ernest and the people over in, I guess it's Proofgeist these days, do they do stuff in the college market, I guess you'd
Well, I
call it?
remember Ernest had given a presentation previously, and a lot of his examples were out of higher education. And so, I mean, his presentations wasn't specifically about anything for higher
That was
education.
on DIGFM. That was like the back to school presentation.
Yeah, and they pointed out the fact that they produced a lot for higher education and why they did, why it was a good choice for higher education. But I think some of the examples they gave and the technology they got into was really about something else, which is okay.
And then tomorrow, you got, it's a busy week. FM Bug is every 2 months, and that means that every 2 months it's three meetings in 1 week. Plus I had a board meeting. That's 4. Gotta get some sleep. Tomorrow looks good. A little user interface. Something we can all agree on.
See if I can get back in time because I have it's a holiday for me tomorrow, and so I'm gonna go out, run the dogs, and then see if I can get back by 9 o'clock.
What holiday is it?
Veterans Day.
Okay, I'm not really good with that. That's good to know.
But it's really Saturday, but it's
No, it's like, right, federal holiday, celebrate. Okay, that's cool. I have to pay myself time and a half.
You do that.
Just,
Yeah, I think you deserve it.
yeah. I'll pay myself time and a half for my volunteer board position. That'll make 0 times. Let me check.
I wonder if Keith can hear us. I know he said he's going off to another meeting. I think it might be an in-person meeting or something like that, but he didn't disconnect.
He said something about living in Thailand.
Or he's taking care of some business there. I don't think he's staying there permanently. I don't know.
That's cool. Hey, Charles, any rumblings out of Sofa? You guys have good meetings when you have them.
Yeah, we do. But yeah, like you gotta hit on Doug. He's our guy there. And I usually send him a text and then I'll couple texts and that usually gets a meeting going. So but we haven't been back in person yet. How many meetups are back in person? Is there like are most of them still virtual now?
I think yes.
Well, all the ones we know about.
Yeah. I mean, I like the idea of them being virtual, but I really do like our in-person meetings. We go for a pint afterwards. It's a good social thing.
Yep.
I guess the thing is that the only ones we have record of are the ones that are not in person.
Yeah, yeah, and it's a shame, right? Because you're losing. Like, it's nice to have a collection on YouTube. Like we have our monthly meetup, and we got, I don't know, quite a few of them now, kind of stacked up, and same as this one. There's quite a few. So
you have you guys have a YouTube channel?
Yep.
Okay, I gotta add it to my list here. I'm gonna guess it's like Sofa YouTube or something.
Oh,
Give
I
us
know.
the link there. Right there in the chat.
Hold on. Did you drop? Can I get a link in the chat? Because I've got
no,
like
I have one for our company, but I don't. Sofa doesn't have one.
I see what you're saying. Okay,
Yeah.
all right. Okay. Well, I did. Let's see. FM Bug was, which is a good group out of England. They were like, "Hey, we need the content," and it was like a week out, maybe even less. And I wanted to do code review, so I have a bit of a starting point. It's not a full-fledged starting point, but it was a UX demo from 10 years ago. And I had fun. It was like a mixture of good code and bad code. I mean, 10 years ago, give me a break. It's got to be bad code in there, right? I've learned a few things over the years. And, I'm easy. I said how much, they said, oh, we'll give you half an hour. I'm like, okay. I got through like 2 or 3 features, but, and I'm hoping they record it because I don't like to repeat myself.
What was that? Sorry.
I did a presentation on Monday, a half-hour presentation for the user group FM Bug.
Yourself. I was bugging you, bud.
What's that?
I
sorry. I went way over my head.
Way
over that was good though. Okay. Yeah. But Eric, when they dropped the recording, I came up with an Apple script that riffs off what Vince Manano showed us. No, actually, it riffs off something else. If you highlight a layout object, a text, and start typing, it'll type over it. So I had it like a field label renaming Apple script.
Using that as a bug or a feature?
No, as a feature. It was like a utility you click on a field name. Like if you have a field name that has a suffix or a prefix or a camel case, I can click on it, run an Apple script from the menu or from one of the buttons, and then have it just retype to a field naming standard. That was my whiz bang. And then after that, it was all simple stuff. I wanted to mix in something that demonstrated that I have the ability to write code, to mix it in with some of the shitty. It was my intention to show some bad code or suboptimum code. Maybe open the door for other people to kind of show like, this is how I used to do it, and here's a way to do it that's better. Makes a good story.
Yeah. It was fun playing around with that with Vince. Was it?
That was a good meeting. Charles, did you see that?
No, I haven't. I haven't watched it. So what's the gist?
Vince showed a presentation and he described it as being a force field. There's a feature in FileMaker whereby if you have a field and a label, and the label, which is text, is within a certain proximity on the layout to the field, if you rename the field from, let's say, first name to name first, the label
changes. Yeah.
Yeah, within a certain force field. That was Vince's.
Oh, so I thought it was as soon as you touch it, but it's within distance. It's proximal.
It is proximal.
So I can break it, and can I make it come back though? Like if I
Um,
break it, if I bring it back, will it, or I can just,
yes,
once it's
yes.
broken, that's it. The
Like
bonds are gone.
no, it's a good question, and the good answer is that if you break the name by renaming the text string, is what you mean, right? And
Yeah, yeah.
then
Oh, no,
rename the
no. By
text.
moving it too far out of this force field, like, do I break the quantum entanglement
Yeah. The
by
force is
moving
no
this
longer
thing
with you.
out there?
Yeah, the force is no longer with you at that point.
Right. And will it come back or no? It's done.
Well, if you no, I see what you're saying. If you move it outside the force field and then you move it back within the force field, I believe that it would be affected by the force.
Well,
So, and it's to me, I thought it was very interesting. And there was another topic that got mentioned by yours truly. It was interesting because I did experience it in the wild. At least once I had a field with the reasonable name of delete. You know, it was like a plausible name. I also had a button that had the word delete on it. And at some point, I think I either renamed delete or deleted the field called delete in a deleting kind of way. And the text label went away. So the feature that's in there, because it's useful for citizen developers, is also has a side effect of producing somewhat fragile code. You know, you just delete a field because you're deleting a field and it whacks the label. So the answer that I would move towards is field names that have the way I like, I like field name suffixes to expose metadata to the to the developer interface. And then you have to get to the questions like, okay, but then you have stupid labels.
what metadata would you expose that's not already there?
Unstored calculated field, unstored calculated number, stored calculated number, stored
That's
calculated
interesting.
text.
Yeah, and a lot of people do that as a practice. They describe their fields and stuff. But do you reference, like, in all fairness, and not to play devil's advocate a little bit, maybe,
It's okay.
do you ever look at that stuff again?
Absolutely.
Like, I know a lot of
Absolutely.
people like their Zs. They love their Z's, sorry. They love their underscores, 2 or 3 underscores, throw maybe 3 or 4 Z's in there, and it pushes it to the bottom. But it's like, for me, it's like, why would I want to push something to the bottom? I follow a naming convention such that ID is called ID. Foreign keys are ID, and then the remote entity, whatever that is, ID invoice. And everything else is semantically named. So there's never a reason why I would want to push stuff to the end or add the metadata in there. Like, I'm not going to make a decision not to use that field because it's an unstored calc.
So you've got like 3
display.
topics in there. Hold on, let me catch up with you there.
Yeah.
The 3 topics. One, the pushing fields to the bottom is, I think, a very useful aspect of a naming convention. I use ZZ underscore.
Yeah, but then I see 3 and 4 and Z. Like, I pair code.
Well, I
with,
wouldn't
like,
do 3 and 4. I'm just
billions
saying
of
what I do. There's some
developers,
crap
right?
code out there.
It's like, I don't know.
But
Prove
so
me
Charles,
wrong.
you're stacking it up here. So one, the just getting back to the original point, because you went tangential there,
Okay.
is the
Off the rails, huh? Okay.
well, not off the rails altogether.
I'm pretty
Tangential.
thick-skinned, Tony, so it's all good, man. It's all good.
The exposing the metadata such that you know the difference between, for example, just use a stupid example, but total, grand total underscore n versus grand total underscore UCN. Okay, UCN would be a suffix, and hopefully it's obvious that would mean unstored calculated number, whereas underscore n would be a number field, because you might be doing something to kind of flatten whatever. So why would you do that? Why would you do that? It's because, and I like to tell it as like, because I'm not smart enough to write code. So if I'm in a script and I'm looking at a field and I see that it's got a suffix that is a calculation, I'm not going to try and set it, right? If it's on the layout, that's one example. That's a valid example. If it's on the layout and it's a and I can see without changing the zone that I'm working in, if I can see that it's a calculated number, then I can expose it. I can say, I can make it available in the browse mode. I can click the little check box, like you can enter this into the browse mode. It's 100% safe. from editing because it's a calculated number field. And I can also click the other little checkbox right underneath such that if you click into that field, it highlights the entire field because I can't edit it. So why wouldn't I highlight the entire field with the intention of copying it? Two terrific examples. Thank you very much.
Yeah, never ran into it once. But then in fairness, I don't develop any UI in FileMaker. I use FileMaker for purely scripting and in a very traditional CRUD type way. And
Yeah.
I've never run into those issues at all.
No, they happen. So that was Vince's presentation. Eric was there for that.
That's
The
cool.
other thing, which maybe also isn't going to matter. Hold on. Oh, force field with Vince. There you go. And look at that. Eric has given you not only the link to the presentation, he's also given you the timestamp. It happened at
Boom.
3,900 seconds in.
Hey, Eric, you you make those cover pages, right?
Yeah.
So I went and got shirts made. Kind of liked it. Yeah, let me see if I can find a picture. I'll find a tweet. I went and got a shirt made with the same thing, the same kind of concept.
Who'd you use to get your custom shirts from?
Those ones were just Sticker Mule because they they come up with these deals and then
Okay. Sticker
so,
Mule. I got something
we
done
do a
by
lot of stuff
Vistaprint.
with Sticker Mule, these guys.
Oh, look at that.
And
Why
if
not?
you get the things. Oh, sorry,
You must have clicked it.
My cousin's an
Oh,
artist.
I must
so I'm
have.
trying to
That's
set it
me.
up.
That's me. Is that me playing? Oh yeah. Sorry.
So then where are we?
Yeah. So Sticker Meal is pretty good because you can order like these kind of stickers and these kinds of things when they're on sale. They're quite cheap.
I
Wow.
like it.
So you know what?
Why not?
You make one. You can make them, give them away, kind of thing. Relatively inexpensive.
I got refrigerator magnets made with the FileMaker Fanatics. Something or other.
Yeah, they have those as well, but nowadays all the fridges are aluminum, or faux. I don't know.
No,
if it's-
Are you
stainless steel.
non-magnetic? Mine's
Yeah.
magnetic.
I guess mine's like a brushed aluminum or something like that. It doesn't.
Well, yeah, but if it's brushed stainless steel, it's not really magnetic. They have to put an actual metal plate behind that to make it
Yeah.
magnetic.
Mine is magnetic. I
Stainless
bought
steel
it
isn't really magnetic.
a year ago.
Yeah.
It's actually solid gold. No, I'm just kidding.
Not magnetic.
I like using the Apple Wallet on my phone.
So where's this T-shirt?
Wait, it's
sure.
an Apple
Sorry, man.
Wallet.
I'm sorry.
Oh, no.
this is why I can't do this. Have nice things or. Okay, just a second.
what were you saying?
Shirt.
I'll show you Ben Miller, who is from. He's a developer in Germany, but he's from England, and let me just see if I can find, here it is. There's one here. So I'll post the link in the chat, the Zoom chat. It's just a link to the Twitter page, but that should open up. But it was in, wait.
Oh, you're posting? Let's look.
Yeah, I posted it in there.
Oh, you could have just shared the screen. Let's see.
Oh yeah,
Wow.
I guess I could do that too. Yeah.
You give him the power? Good.
Yeah. You just gotta make sure there's nothing. Let me just make sure all the naughty things are closed. Yeah, we should be good.
Hey, you did it.
Yeah. No, remember I said to you, I said, hey, you know what? I'm gonna make some t-shirts. So I went and ordered a bunch because I needed. We have other t-shirts, but for swag, but we ran out. And by the time you make an order for like 40 or something shirts, takes a while to get it all sorted out, and you fiddle with the designs and stuff. I said, screw it, I'm just gonna make one. I'm not gonna let the UX designer look at it because he's gonna say he doesn't like it and doesn't go against
you got
branding.
Used all pentaminers there, huh?
Yeah, exactly. Right. So
And a perfect use too, right? Build anything with pentaminoes.
Yeah. It's kind of like, for people who get it, it's kind of cool because I kept thinking, how am I going to do the other letters? Oh yeah, you turn them sideways. Now you can get all the other letters, right? So, or not sideways, but 45. So that was
diagonal. Different angles.
So anyhow, Have you guys played with have you been doing anything with OpenAI lately?
No. My
You want to see,
10 more since the last time you demoed this?
This is totally, well, it's not totally different, but it's new now. So check this out. You go to, this is something that we've been here. If I do this, clear this, I say create an invoice key with typical invoice fields, including line.
Are you? It's not showing up. Are you typing into the void?
That's you know what? I do about twice as much typing as I need to. For that reason, I have to learn to look at the screen. Create a invoice key with typical line items, addresses, and totals, etc.
Can you just speak to the OpenAI?
Pardon me?
Does it have accept input from a mic?
Yeah, you can do that, and I could actually add that in. And yeah, there's a little glitch in here, but just do this. Okay, so now we got this thing: billing address, shipping address, line items. There's your typical invoice. All right, and then we do this. Yeah, let me erase this, and I say create a pretty invoice. Okay, it's passing up that sample data, but that sample data normally would come from your database. And so, but it's passing that to OpenAI. Now, this one is calling it from the server, so you don't get any live feedback. There's no continuous streaming, so it feels like you're waiting a long time. Probably change that, because that's the easiest to do, and it doesn't expose your API key. But
yeah.
But it hopefully will demo, right? Hopefully will return. It does take a long time.
Wait, are you exposing anything here?
Pardon me?
Is your API key exposed here?
No. So this is just doing a call to the backend, and then the backend is calling that invoice.
Okay.
So hopefully it is actually working and didn't time out. It should throw an error if it did, or something. It shouldn't time out, but we'll see.
So while it's running,
and OpenAI has been really slow lately. Sorry, Tony.
So while it's running, I attended a bunch of these AI presentations. Starting the first one was the LA group FM Disc. I'm spacing on the name. What I would like to see, and Erica, I just for fun, I gave Erica an award for the best post-production in the FileMaker community. By the way, back to you, because I see that it's completed.
Yeah, I didn't like that one, so I just hit undo. Complete invoice that is both printable and screenable. That's not really a word, but it's really slow right now because they had a bunch of crashes this morning. I think it crashed, or yesterday or this morning. Anyway, they're just having some infrastructure problems.
All right. So
really
Russell Cohen for the LA group, and I put more of a question, but maybe a challenge. It's like, can we use artificial intelligence to take the output from a FileMaker presentation, which would be either just the chat, and just say, like, take the transcript and make it useful.
Yeah, there's some really good things that are already out there. There's a lot of tools that do that. There we go. And there is an invoice. Let's see if it made it responsive. Not the greatest for responsiveness.
Can you tell it that numbers should be right aligned?
Yeah, you can actually. And you can start dialing things in and say, hey, okay, format this as currency and do things like that. It's messed this one up. This is actually the worst one I've seen. And prompting does make a bit of a difference. What I've actually done is I found some famous UX designers and say, make it in the theme.
Make it look like
yeah. And
Salvador Dali, see what happens.
Yeah, those kinds of right. Those kinds of things. But the takeaway here is that I've literally made something that's kind of functional. And this is honestly, this is the worst one. I've done this probably about 5 times in the past day. And this is the worst one it's been. They're usually quite a bit better. For some reason, I don't know why, the tax is always weird rounding. And I guess maybe the original, I don't know if the original that data was like that. Here's a dark themed one. Or what? I don't see it in here, the tax.
So is that generating HTML essentially? That's what
It's generating HTML and it's styling that HTML as well. Right.
Now is this
So
HTML? Oh, could you tell it to
sorry.
generate within the framework if you were using Bootstrap or Vue or
yes,
something like
yeah. Part of this prompting is using Tailwind CSS, so it doesn't have to. Tailwind is a framework that you don't have to use any actual CSS classes. So it's really transportable. And the neat thing is
Okay.
you can grab external stuff. You can grab a card from the web, paste it in here, and then you go and say, here's my data from FileMaker, wire it up, and it'll do
Okay.
it.
That's cool.
It's
Jumpstart.
pretty powerful.
Probably look at it after.
Yeah, it's just stuff that you can do. I mean, this is how we've used it so far, but it's pretty crazy how much, like, and we haven't really, I came up with this months ago and we sat on it because it wasn't fast enough. And then just 2 days ago, OpenAI released version 4 Turbo, GPT-4 Turbo, which is finally fast enough to actually do something useful. In bigger volume, and it has 128K aperture, so that means you can tokens, 128K tokens, which means you can like throw significantly large volumes of data into it and do stuff against that. Before it was limited. Even this interface here, if I go about 2 or 3 times as big as that invoice was, that's about pushing the limit of data it can chunk because of the raw JSON and stuff like that. So it's kind of getting close, but now with 100, I was at 3K, now at 128K, it's 30 times bigger. So it's significantly bigger. So it's pretty amazing what you can do. Incidentally, I think I talked about that before, but they have functions, and this is just running it's basically passing functions back, and the GPT is smart enough to say, you tell it, I have a script that does this, I have a script that does that, and it'll call that effectively off. It'll give the command to call it, and then you call it from another script. And suddenly you have this really smart interface. And it's amazing that nobody I've seen is doing anything significant with it. But
I would think, and I'm not, I would think that the GPT would be, that the appropriate use of GPT would be to get it to write code or get it to write the output of the invoice that looks like that as a jump start, and then look at the code and invoke your human intelligence to optimize the visual and or the speed of the code. And then that to me would seem to be the use case. But I'm mostly programming in FileMaker and or AppleScript.
You can. So the biggest problem right now is there's just not that much stuff that's really readily available, because FileMaker is not a code base that you can just commit to GitHub. So you can't just scrape billions and billions of lines. So where do you get the lines of code? GPT knows some FileMaker, but where do you get the code from? Well, you have to get it from forums and stuff where it can scrape, which is just snippets. Now, having said that,
absolutely true.
GPT just came out with GPTs. This is earlier this week, which are trainable versions of GPT that you can put on their GPT app store, and they can do specialized things. So if somebody from our community was to say, hey, I have 100 well-written solutions, I could use that as a training corpus for these GPTs, and I can teach GPT FileMaker. And I just have to give it some prompting, and this is the script that it would do, and give it some more prompting and give it some script and put some documentation in those scripts. So there's a bit of work that has to go in there. You have to format that in a way that you can consume it. So you have to take a script, put it in some text lines, put it in a body of text, maybe put it in its own little mini database and say, here's the prompt and here's what I expect. So if somebody was to say, hey guys, how can I filter this thing here on this layout and do this and then do that thing? It's like, okay. And then here's an example script. So you'd have to give those combinations.
Because remember Soliant would come out the FileMaker training series, and they had all those demo files that came along with it. wonder how smart, whether it could actually pick all that stuff up and pick apart read the text of the
Well,
training,
that's just it. It's really
And then-
good and
and
intuitive.
then go look at the demo files and go, oh, this is what you're talking about. And
You know,
put it
here's the
together.
thing. Here's what I've done. I've taken some stuff off the clipboard, right? I've taken some actual FileMaker script, put it on the clipboard, and used base elements to peel it off so it's in readable text. I fed that into GPT and I said, this is a script that does this. And I said, change, I forget what I said to change it so it's not using this field and using that field and blah, blah, blah. And it spit the stuff back out and it actually worked.
Oh, you pasted it back in and it worked, huh?
Yeah. Like it put out well-formatted XML. So it's pretty dang good. Like you say, this is XML and it'll make sure that it's, well-formed and so on. So it's pretty decent. We have a project in-house. It's I have another product in the film industry, and we just launched last month actually. And it takes a film industry script and it scrapes it for information. And prior to this, we were scraping the script and trying to figure out, okay, is this a character? Jennifer said this, Tom said that, Jennifer said this, and trying to figure out what the class of each line is. This is dialogue, this is scene description, this is a page summary and stuff like that. So classification. And we had built a state machine, basically a bunch of deeply conditional statements that say, if you see, it's a line number and a number on each end of the statement, and there's a bunch of spaces, it's probably a page number. And, if you see something centered versus on the left side or the right side, it's probably a heading and dialogue text. And if it's following this, so the state machine sort of looks at the previous line and says what the probabilities of the next line are. And it worked pretty good. We wrote that as quick and dirty because there was no AI at the time. And it's pretty accurate. But 97%, 99% accurate is still 1 out of 100 errors. So that's every 3 pages there's an error on it, right? Which is major when you're filtering and
because then you have to babysit it. So it's
exactly.
It's just like with a problem with our OCRs. Like OCR is so bad that you end up having to do part of the work anyway, because you have to go through and read the whole thing, make sure you got it right.
Yep.
I think if you take
weird how there's things that are really obvious to humans that for some reason our OCR engines aren't getting. It's like, why didn't you see that?
Yeah. But have you seen what GPT OCR can do? Like I fed it a flyer. I gave it hold on, Canva. Let me just see if I can find it here. Check this out. I gave it this. Okay, this is a flyer for our upcoming talk at Engage, right? And there's a front of a flyer and the back of a flyer. I took a screenshot. Okay, well, actually, we'll do it again.
And that's not a PDF. That's strictly an image, right?
This is strictly an
image. Just an image.
Yeah. So you're not scraping it. You're actually OCRing, but you're OCRing all kinds of crazy stuff. Oh, come on, get this. Sorry, the Zoom keeps popping back on there, and it's gonna mess up my screenshot here. This isn't the greatest quality screenshot, but
makes it a better test.
Yeah, but check this out. Yeah.
Can you tell what to summarize?
So this is a flyer for an upcoming conference. Review it and give me suggestions on improving. Okay. All right. Let's see. Hopefully you can see how slow it is.
And Charles, how much are you paying for the service that you're showing? This is
$20 a month. It's pittance. Right? Like I literally pay $100 a month right now. It's crazy. Like
don't tell them. Don't say that.
Oh no, I know.
They might hear you.
So here presents a clear and vibrant design. It's got the concept of the design. This flyer is for nothing, okay? For capturing the attention. Here are a few suggestions: contrast and legibility. Ensure that the text over the image. I don't know if there's text over the image. Maybe it sees this as an image. If there is not enough contrast, consider adding semi-transport. Presenter highlight. Charles Dawes was prominently featured, which is excellent. However, consider adding a brief, compelling tagline that encompasses his expertise, because there's nothing like some kind of little line under here it's saying, right? Information hierarchy. Make sure the most critical information, such as the event name, stands out the most. Secondary information should be as easy to distinguish. Call to action to flip me over. Okay, so hear that. It got this, flip me over, and it got the arrow. Okay. But it may not be immediately evident to all readers what the action should do or what they should expect, right? QR codes, effective tool, like it's pretty dang good, man.
Charles, did this flyer go out the door, or is this a work in progress?
Yeah, it did. Why is there a typo?
So in the book, looking good in print, what I would say,
I got that book. That's a black book with a white or silver text.
Yeah.
That's classic. Yeah, I've had that for years. Yeah.
What I would say is, I'm just looking at the text trusted by leading developers. The white
that one's
serif,
thin, eh?
hold on, let me just finish. The white sans serif font, relatively thin. In other words, they would, I forget what page it would be like. It tends, if you printed, the ink would bleed and kind of fills in a little bit.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay,
totally agree.
Anyway, it's fun to. I'm not a designer, but when I decided to leave Wall Street and just to make an honest living, I read a book, and with a little bit of mathematical skill and just reading a book by someone who knows on design, I was able to kind of find my way a little bit. Can I see the flyer again just for fun? I think they're totally right that. I like, upper left. That's good. FM Better Forms. That's a good looking logo. The picture is cute. The Monday, a small amount of text. So what that is, that seems reasonable. I like the Join Charles Deaf, the upper lower. A little bit of all caps. I sometimes print out these documents, and FileMaker, Clarison, they tend to give me this thing, and if I print it out, I'm going to have to buy another toner cartridge kind of deal.
Yeah.
So
I'm surprised it didn't offer some other suggestions on that QR code though.
Well, you know what? It's pretty readable. It does work. It should work even on your thing. Although that'll be an old version of the app. We need to push out a new version of the app. I should deploy one.
That works, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, you can.
It seems pretty high resolution though. It's I try to get the minimal text in there so it actually can make some bigger dots.
Yeah. This one here, you can control that by these two dots right here. Determine the error correction. You can set 3 different levels or 4 different levels. It's just those 2 dots. I didn't know that until I started a PDF project where we made one that was. That's kind of the thing we had a PDF thing that we made for a client where the client sends out PDFs. They assemble this 30-page application thing for say a military employee. It's kind of interesting. And if that person gets it and they have to screen this, I want to apply for the Army, so they have to screen a whole bunch of things. They have to go to their dentist and make sure there's no major cavities, and they have to go to their heart doctor, and they have to go to a psychologist or whatever. They have to do all of these things and get them all signed up, but they give it to them in a PDF, and they might send those PDFs off, and then the doctor will send the PDF back to the company, the screening company. So they have a person that takes this stuff back, and they've got to assemble these 50-page things for hundreds of people, and they're all coming in at different times. So the app that we built them, and we don't normally build non-Better Forms-based stuff, but this seemed really kind of fun, so it's okay, I'll do it, is we built a PDF viewer, and it'll automatically place a QR code on the page, and every page is different. Like this one here, I'd have to put the QR code here or here or here. But I couldn't put it I can't put it in here somewhere. So it can't just arbitrarily. So for a given type of page, this is a dentist application, this is where the QR code goes. So first of all, it landmarks and you go click, and then it knows it for that particular page for all future uses. And then when they go to print the page, it automatically puts a unique ID with a base 90, it's about base 60 something, 62, 63, something like that characters. So enough unique characters so that you can reduce the overall length and still keep enough entropy. And physically really, really small. We want to keep it as short as possible so that the density of the docs can be as big as possible. And it has the best chance for degradation in like fax machines and stuff. And then we built another system. That was the first system. That first one that annotates it. The second one marks it up dynamically. And then the third one, they automatically, when they get a document in, they just feed it into this machine. And it finds the QR code on the page, scans it, and spits it all out. So you take it, give it a PDF of any documents, and it spits all the, it says page 1 is this unique ID, page 2 is that one, page 3 is that one, for the ingress of it. It was pretty cool. So.
Sounds like fun.
Yeah. But anyhow, yeah, so this is, but I just think it's kind of neat to do this kind of stuff. Like, it's pretty, like, I don't know, if you haven't tried it, like,
I like the pragmatic uses. I don't have a huge amount of concerns about AI. You know, I'm like more concerned about